Hello and welcome to another presentation put together by Plymouth County Extension. My name is Blake Dinius, and I work as the entomologist educator for Plymouth County Extension. Before this role, I worked in insect research, mostly worked with honeybees. This is an example of how we would graft honeybees from a beehive and put them in these well plates so that we could grow them and rear them to adulthood. In my current role, I give education on a number of different topics, anything from ticks to mosquitoes to bed bugs to lice to leading backyard walks, looking for butterflies. But you can think of me as a giant bug nerd, and I've loved bugs my entire life. So let's start with a question. I want you to name a food. I'm not going to be polling this, but just be thinking about it. Name a food that can solve food insecurity, stop climate change, make you money, make you healthy, and also tastes really good. There is one food that can do this, and it might come as a surprise. It's actually insects. And this actually blew my mind when I started reading more about this, and it was something that I just couldn't believe that people hadn't kind of taken advantage of, or this is still a topic that still requires a lot of persuasion to get people to want to eat bugs because they're just so beneficial. And let's walk you through this. So I know that this sounds really crazy. My entire life, I had never eaten bugs, at least not intentionally, honestly, until about a year ago. And this is for someone who loves bugs, loves studying bugs. I never intentionally tried to eat them until very, very recently. And it was only after I had started reading more about this subject. So let's start off with this. So the human population, it continues to increase. By 2050, it's estimated that the world population is estimated at 9 billion people. And there's a rising demand for meat. By 2030, the demand for food will increase by 50%. And this is particularly felt in some of the more poorer countries where there might be a high amount of malnutrition, and that might impact child growth and development. So insects are to the rescue. They're high in nutrients. They include basically everything that you would get from meat, eggs, and milk. In one particular study, they found that a bread made with African palm weevil, which is a pretty common beetle to find, had all the major and minor nutrients essential for body growth. So you could just continue baking bread and just include this African palm weevil in it, and that would be all that you would need to eat. I mean, you might get a little bit bored of it, but that would provide everything that a developing person would need. In this other study, they found that wheat buns enriched with termites not only tasted better, but were better for you. In this other book, they found that eating silkworms can fulfill a deficiency in riboflavin. And insects are very, very high in protein content. And this is just a comparison. I've got the beef and cod on the right, which are about 27 and 28%, 27, 29% protein. But if you look at the insects on the left, they far eclipse the beef and cod in terms of protein. And some insects, and these are averages too, so there are some insects, particularly the grasshoppers, locusts, and crickets, that can be as high as 90% protein. So they have much more protein packed into a smaller amount. There's also the issue of global warming, right, or climate change is what they call now. So 18% of total emission from anthropogenic greenhouse gases. So this is basically the amount that we are generating in greenhouse gases. It's coming from agriculture. So 18% of all of the stuff that the greenhouse gases produced by humans is coming from agriculture. Agriculture also consumes 70% of the world's fresh water, and livestock production takes up 75% of all agricultural land. So if you look at this map below, all of the red, that's how much land is being used and devoted to agriculture. It's a massive amount of land. I mean, this statistic below, 26% of the Earth's ice-free land is devoted to pastures. And then another almost 3% is devoted just to feed that livestock. So it's very clear that current agricultural practices are just not sustainable. Again, insects are to the rescue. So when we talk about greenhouse gas production, if you look at the right, you can see that cattle produce far more, almost 3,000 grams per kilogram of mass gain. And if you look at mealworms, crickets, and locusts, it's shockingly low. Pigs have a wide variety of greenhouse gases, but they can produce over 1,000, anywhere from about 200 to over 1,000. But the insects produce far fewer greenhouse gases. They take less water to produce. So a cricket might take 500 liters of water to produce a kilogram of crickets. On the other hand, if you look at beef, 43,000 liters of water to produce a kilogram of beef. It's unbelievable. Raising cattle and livestock also takes up a lot of space, as we showed earlier, where a lot of the Earth's ice-free land is devoted to agriculture. On the other hand, when you start breeding insects, when you're talking about farming insects, you can build vertically. You can build these in warehouses, and you can build them up as opposed to always building them horizontally, which means that they take less space, and you can farm a lot more animal protein per acre. So in this particular graph, this is taken from EnviroFlight. I'm not entirely sure how reliable these numbers are, but this company estimates that farming black soldier fly, which is kind of insect, is over 3,000 times more efficient than farming cattle, which is a wild number. And this is pounds of protein per acre per year. And the black soldier fly can generate 136,000 pounds of protein per acre. They're also more efficient to feed. So this is something that's going to save farmers money. So this efficiency of food conversion, that's how much feed, how much food you need to actually give to the livestock in order to convert them, in order to raise them, in order to convert them into protein, into food. So insects are 2 times more efficient to feed than pigs, 2 times more efficient to feed than chicken, 4 times more efficient than sheep, and 6 times more efficient to feed than beef. More of the animal is also edible. So if you focus on the top part, in a cricket, about 80% of the animal is edible, as opposed to beef on the far right, where only about 40% of that cow is edible. And insects, in addition to just being, more efficient to produce, they take up less space, consume less water. There are other benefits to farming insects. So if anyone has heard of the 1 in every 3 bites of food comes from a bee or comes from pollinators, this is kind of a quote or a little factoid that gets passed around the internet quite often. But another little factoid is that 1 in every 3 bites of food ends up in a landfill. And this is actually an estimate by the World Health Organization, where they estimate 32% of all the food produced ends up in a landfill. What's really impactful about this, and actually shocking, is that rotting food emits millions of tons of CO2 into the atmosphere. Rotting food produces 7% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions, and rotting food is the 3rd top emitter of greenhouse gases after the USA and China. So the total amount of rotting food in the world is producing more greenhouse gas emissions than entire countries, which is a completely crazy thing when you really think about it. Again, insects are to the rescue. At a Louisiana State University, so this is one example, students throw out more than 1,000 pounds of food per day. You can take that food, that wasted food, and you can actually compost it using black soldier flies, and they'll consume this wasted food. What's good about the black soldier flies is that you can feed those right back to the livestock. And so you can convert all of this wasted food that would just rot and generate all of those greenhouse gas emissions, and you can actually convert that into food that you can then feed to animals. Black soldier flies can actually convert contaminated food into basically an edible food source. So they'll actually process these mycotoxins, and then you can feed those black soldier flies to the livestock, again, as a clean food source that the chickens might be able to eat. So the animal feed industry as well. So this is also where insects, the concept of eating insects or using insects as feed can actually make you money. The animal feed industry is a $400 billion industry. And this is an estimate based on the International Feed Industry Federation. So again, I'm not entirely sure about that statistic. I couldn't dig up any scholarly articles on that. So we would just have to take their word for it. But needless to say, it makes a lot of money. And this is an example of students that took advantage of how lucrative that the feed industry is. So there's this prestigious award called the Halt Prize. And in 2012, they awarded $1 million seed capital to college students looking to basically meet certain criteria like solving challenges of food scarcity. These students took that $1 million and they created a cricket farm. And in the first year, they had 25,000 square feet and they could produce 22 million crickets per month. In 2018, so a few years later, they upgraded that to 50,000 feet. And in just last year, they upgraded that to 250,000 feet. And now that building that is producing these crickets is generating $10.6 million per year. So you can think in 7 years, these group of college students took $1 million and are now generating $10.6 million. So if you can do this efficiently, this can be a very lucrative profession for you. And these students, they're not necessarily entomologists. A lot of them, I believe, are engineers where they can actually create these cricket producing systems and develop space where they can efficiently manufacture these crickets. So there's a lot of thought that kind of goes into this, and this is definitely a multidisciplinary study. But there are definitely legal challenges to producing insects as food. For example, the food code is not adapted to insects as food. There are no specific standards for producing insects as food. And what they recommend is these 4 points below. That if we are to move forward with producing insects as food, that we breed them for human consumption, that they require bacteriological testing, and this thing called GMP certification, that's good manufacturing practices. These are very strict regulations. I know you might be thinking, well, what is good? How do you define good? It's actually a set of rules and regulations that are very specific. And if you're eating insects, they should include both the common name and scientific name. They also should note allergy potential because eating insects, some of the stuff in insects, particularly chitin, it overlaps with shellfish allergies. So there is a risk to eating insects around people that might be allergic to shellfish. And there could even be other allergies present in insects as well. Our ancestors probably highly depended on insects. I know we have this thought that as cavemen, quote unquote, we were mostly eating meat and hunting woolly mammoths and bears and all these other kinds of animals. But really, when we look at it, when we take a look at some of what the archaeologists have been finding, is that insects made up a very large fraction of our diet, particularly for women that might have needed to have this high nutritious food source. So as a man, for instance, you might have been able to survive feast and famine and go for long periods of time not eating meat and not getting the adequate amount of nutrition. But if you were a woman that was carrying a child that needed to provide for a developing baby, you might have needed a very consistent supply of highly nutritious food. And so the archaeologists think that people used to gather insects on a much more regular basis. I mean, if you think if they're just as good as meat, that they provide the same nutrition, they're less risky to get, they're not gonna bite your head off, and they're more consistent to find year round. So why wouldn't we be eating these? And we think that one of the reasons why we have this perception of humans basically fighting woolly mammoths and bears has just been that archaeologists have neglected this concept because we just don't like insects for some reason. That there is this inherent bias in the way we have been looking at the history of our development. What we found by looking at different cultures is that eating insects is not what we call a fallback food. This is not something that people eat in times where food is scarce or where they can't get enough. This is something that people actually look forward to, that it's a staple part of their diet, that they really enjoy eating it. There are over 2 billion people in the world that consume insects. And then when I was reading about this, I found that some of the quotes that people use to describe how they prepare insects is not the way you would describe something that you were just eating just to sustain yourself. These are things that are prepared very carefully and done with, and basically sound really, really good. So in one example, it says the insects were made into a porridge with thin slices of ginger, or they are stir fried with soybean sauce and shallots. Another quote said, they're fried, stewed, grilled, or roasted, often with condiments including onions, pepper, and salt. And they're often incorporated into a paste, clarified as fat, and used as butter. So once again, these are not something that people are just eating because they're desperate. They have these recipes, they have ways of preparing them, and a lot of those same ways that you would prepare, let's say, a turkey or something that you really, really enjoy. And what they found is that once people started eating these things, eating insects, that they actually really enjoy them. At Safeco Field at the Seattle Mariners game, they were selling packs of grasshoppers, and you can see this container, for $4. And they actually sold out. They had to impose a limit because they sold over 18,000 of these packets of grasshoppers. Now, what I would really like to see is how much beer they sold at this game as well, because I have a feeling that that heavily influenced the amount of grasshoppers that people were eating. What's interesting is that we find that insect consumption correlates with latitude. So the closer you are to the equator, the more likely you are to eat insects. And we believe that this has a lot to do with the availability of insects, that they're more available in warmer climates, and that cultures have adapted to their use. So it's so if you look at kind of the northern hemisphere and like really far northern latitudes, it's really cold in Europe, Russia, and Canada. And you can see by their light colored, basically they're white. It means they almost consume no insects, that they're really virtually not consumed at all. And where it's warmer towards the equator, you can see that they're much darker green, that they're consuming a lot more species of insect. What's interesting is that it's warm in the USA, and you would think that the USA should look a lot like maybe Mexico below it, or even China off to the right. But for some reason, it's just not that dark. And it's this really weird question, why is there this stark break between Mexico and Texas, for instance, when they really should be eating the same stuff? And we believe this has a lot to do with how America was discovered. When Columbus came over, so we have a very high heritage and a high influence of Europe, where Europeans never really ate that many insects. And so we think that our diet is heavily influenced by the European diet, particularly when Columbus came over. So when Columbus came over, the first thing he really wanted to do was develop sugar. And this is really wild to me that he didn't have the foresight to feed his settlers. And in fact, the next year, many of the settlers fell ill and died. And this was primarily attributed to malnutrition. So the people came over, they started farming for money, but they didn't actually farm for food, and they didn't want to eat what the natives were eating. And so they ended up dying. And so in 1494, Columbus and the settlers decided to bring over the food from Europe. So it took them 2 years and deaths of many settlers to actually figure out, hey, if we're not going to eat what the natives are eating, that we need to actually bring over food. Their first objective was producing money for their home country. One of the reasons why they didn't want to adapt to what the natives were eating is that there was this clear separation of us and them. And they actually felt that eating the food that the natives were eating would alter their diet, would change their physique from the European physique to the native physique. They thought that you literally are what you eat, that if you ate what the natives were eating, you would look like the natives. And what's interesting is that in areas that were settled differently, so when you look at Central America, and this is where you would look at Mexico, there were centralized city-states. And what we found is that this allowed people in rural areas around those cities to retain a lot of the traditions and customs, which is why you can find this dish called like chapulines in Mexico, because these cultures and these traditions were preserved. That when the settlers came and they settled Central America, they didn't need to set up new infrastructure. In North America, however, we had this sweeping expansion, and that's what the pink on this left image represents, is that when we settled America, there wasn't the centralized cities and infrastructure already in place, that we had to develop that. And in order to do that, we pushed a lot of natives out of their territories. And in 1830, we had the Indian Removal Act, and you can see that below here, in the right image below, where you can see that these in the lower southwest, lower southeast, which should be a prime area for eating insects and should be heavily incorporated into the diets of people, that the people who might actually have been eating these insects were then relocated into territories where their diets might have been uprooted and their traditions and customs would just completely have been, basically might even disappear. We also think that the advent of monocropping and farming helped to make people afraid of eating insects. That the concept that if you are growing this large plot of land and you're only farming, say, corn, that the presence of an insect might be extremely detrimental to your family's livelihood. And so we feel that maybe this fear of insects and seeing just one insect in your food or one insect in your area might be representative of this concept that maybe it would lead to financial ruin. And so we think that that fear has been passed on through generations. We also think that one of the reasons why Americans haven't adapted to eating insects is this thing called neophobia. So what we know about insects is that there's not anything inherently scary about them. Some people may be scared of spiders, or they might be scared of creepy crawly things, but it's not necessarily the same as, say, snakes. When they have run studies on people being afraid of snakes, for instance, they found that in babies, that showing someone screaming while showing a video of a snake slithering, it stimulates a fear response in babies. But that is not necessarily the case with insects. With insects, it's something different. And we think it's more attributed to disgust, which is different than fear, or this concept of neophobia, trying new things. But when you look at insects, they actually look a lot like things that we already consume, like lobsters, shrimp, and prawns. But when it comes to disgust, it might have to do with the fact that we associate insects with contamination. If you look at the FDA's level for basically their defect handbook, and this is something you can just Google, I think you would find it really disgusting to know how many insects might already be present in your food. Particularly peanut butter, they show that they allow an average of 30 or more insect fragments per 100 grams of peanut butter, which is actually kind of disgusting. And that's an allowable amount. But once again, people don't like this. In a lot of people's mind, the allowable amount should be 0 insect fragments in your peanut butter. So how can we overcome this fear of eating insects? The first thing we can do is recognize that we have this inherent bias towards not wanting to eat them. The next thing we can do is make edible insects more convenient. Right now, even though they can make a lot of money and they are beneficial, there just isn't the infrastructure to mass produce them like there is for other products. And so the cost of producing insects right now is still relatively high. We need to find ways to prepare them and make them look like things that we're already familiar with, because they have found that this is one way that people will start eating them. If you're looking for additional information on edible insects, this book, Edible Insects and Human Evolution, is really, really good. And there's also a TED Talks that it's called Why Not Eat Insects, is really, really good as well. As far as preparing them into food that we already enjoy, there are a number of people that are already trying to do this. And you can see this example below, these chocolate chirp cookies, and even this cricket powder is another thing that people seem to be more willing to try out, adding cricket powder to like a shake, for instance, and getting all the nutrients that you might need from another type of protein powder. Cricket pasta looks seems to look exactly like regular pasta, and this tortilla chip below looks exactly like a regular tortilla chip. So these are some of the ways that certain companies are trying to get people to eat insects. And then if you think about that tortilla chip being as nutritious for you as a burger or a piece of meat, that's actually really appealing. And if it actually might even taste better than a normal tortilla chip, again, another really appealing aspect about this. If you're interested in reading about how to prepare insects, the Eat a Bug cookbook has been around for decades, for a really, really long time. And then there's this Food Insects newsletter. This was a newsletter. It was actually discontinued in 2000, but you can find them on Facebook now, and it's still a very active group. And at this point, I'll take any questions. If you're new to this program, at the bottom of your screen, you should be able to see either a chat, a Q&A, or a hand raise feature. You can use either three of those. The chat or the Q&A feature seems to work really well. But the hand raise feature, if you wanted to, I've discovered I can do this thing where I can allow you to talk. And so I'm gonna go ahead and try that this time. So I had a hand raise from Adrian. So we're gonna go ahead and allow you to talk right now.
Oops, I was just typing it. Is there going to be is there a recording of this that we'll be able to watch after? Because we missed the beginning.
There is a recording of this. I have started recording it, and cool. I should be able, if you just shoot me an email, I should be able to send you that recording. The recording, it usually takes, sometimes it takes a couple hours for the recording to process, and sometimes it's like 30 minutes.
Okay.
Thank you. And the next question is from Charlotte. You can go ahead and talk. Charlotte?
Hi, Blake.
Hi.
I didn't raise my hand, but we were just wondering what they taste like. Do you have a favorite way of eating bugs personally?
Oh, sorry. I thought that I saw an alert for that. I guess it might not have been. They can taste, some of them taste very different. So a lot of them, so the ones that I've tried, full disclosure, I've only really tried the kind that have been basically like the ranch flavored or buffalo flavored. So it really kind of overpowers their natural flavor. But you get kind of, like, from what I've read, some of them taste a lot like lobster or shrimp or other kinds of shellfish. But there are some that have very unique flavors, and there's one that someone even described as tasting like bacon. So they have this like very full range of different flavors. There's a giant water bug, people say, has a very unique earthy flavor. I mean, I haven't tried all those. Oh yeah, termites. There's, in the book, The Edible Insects in Evolution, the woman who wrote that says that there's a kind of termite that she found in Africa that tastes like popcorn. And that's not having any butter added at all, just taking the termites and roasting them on a fire. It's crazy to me. It's such a crazy topic. So thank you for your question.
Yeah.
Are there any other questions? All right, thank you for attending. I'm going to go ahead and wrap up. If you enjoyed this presentation, once again, there's going to be a recording. If you have any questions, you can feel free to contact me through email. And next week, we're going to be giving another presentation. So this one is going to be on invasive insects in New England. So there's one insect in particular that I think people would be curious about, and that's the spotted lanternfly. This is something that might not have been getting a lot of press, but I think when this actually comes to Massachusetts, people are going to want to know a lot about it. So we're going to be discussing spotted lanternfly, past and present pests like gypsy moth and winter moth, and even the emerald ash borer, which was seen in Plymouth County for the first time last year. So I'm looking forward to that one. And if you want to attend that, feel free to. Thank you and have a nice day.